Alrighty guys, we are not going to dilly-dally too long on the intro today because we have a lot to get into, and this video is probably already going to be pretty lengthy. So, hi, my name is Rebecca, I'm an independent journalist. Welcome to the Deep Dive Project. For those of you who are return viewers, our topic of conversation today needs no introduction. You are already well aware. But if you are new here, if you somehow wandered in from some other corner of the internet and you're wondering what in the world that you're doing here, I have been presenting information and research on the Catholic organization Opus Dei since 2020. I became aware of some pretty significant human rights violations that were occurring and nobody was talking about it. And so I decided to do something about that. Since then, it has been quite a journey, and if the name Opus Dei jogs your memory a bit, it might be because you are remembering it from the Da Vinci Code. That was kind of what put Opus Dei on the map and launched their PR campaign of saving face against the public scrutiny. But don't get it twisted. The version of Opus Dei that is presented in the Da Vinci Code is a caricature of something that does not even resemble the truth of what Opus Dei truly is. So if that sounds like something that you might be interested in, I won't belabor the point anymore. I have quite a few videos covering the topic, and you can find them all saved on a playlist over on my channel. So check those out if you are interested. Today, though, we are going to be talking about something very specific to the Opus Dei sphere, something that I think is the canary in the coal mine, the smoking gun, the be-all, end-all for presenting and encapsulating and covering all of the problems with Opus Dei. So I am, of course, if you haven't guessed it by now, referring to the International Ecclesiastical Institutional Complaint against Opus Dei for regulatory fraud against the Holy See and the members themselves. It is a 20-page document, and the information contained herein, I really do not know how Opus Dei is going to be okay after this if the Vatican and the Holy See do their job. And obviously, as you can see, I have had my way with this document. I have added tabs, I have added notes in the margins, I have added highlights. We are going to be going over this thing. Because it is 20 pages, I cannot go over every single bit of it, even though it is all significant. So I will leave a link down in the description of this video, along with all of my other sources. I highly encourage you to go and read it for yourself. The authors put this together and then uploaded it to a Scribd file on the Scribd site so that the public could go and download it and read it for themselves. They want this information to be seen, and I think we owe it to them, we owe it to their tenacity and bravery to hear what they have to say and to take it seriously. So it's been translated into, I want to say, 7 or 8 languages, so whatever your flavor, you should be able to understand it, and I highly encourage you to go and check it out. But we'll be focusing on some of the things that really stood out to me, some of the things that are, in my opinion, the most egregious, the most damning. Even though as an entirety it's pretty intense. With that being said, I do want to issue a quick trigger warning, of course, because we are going to be talking about some pretty heavy things, some pretty heavy topics, and if you are a sensitive audience, I do not want you to put yourself in a position where you are being negatively affected by those things, so proceed with caution. So let's start at the very top, shall we? Let's start with why this complaint is being levied in the first place. The authors say that it is Opus Dei's institutional regulatory fraud, which has become systematically hidden from the church hierarchy. This situation has allowed the statutes, the legal normative document of Opus Dei, to be de facto replaced by 46 internal documents with a normative character, both external and internal. The daily government of Opus Dei was based in these documents, where the bases are laid for the systematic violation of respect for the dignity of the person through abuses of power, conscience, and spirituality. Now, for all of us who are already aware of what Opus Dei truly is and what they have been doing, none of this will necessarily be news. But to have it all presented in such a concise manner right here is really something to see. They start with sort of laying out Opus Dei's obsession with the personality of Jose Maria Escrivá, and that leads directly into the bite model, which is the model for assessing whether or not an organization is a cult or displaying cult-like tendencies. But what's really, really interesting about those 46 books that they mention, which from what I understand are a collection of meditations and letters and other documents created during the very early days of Opus Dei, Opus Dei has always denied that those things exist because they would fly in the face of church authority. But some time ago, somebody or a group of somebodies sent copies of those 46 books to the popular website Opus Libris, and they were published there. And Opus Dei ended up suing Opus Libris because they had copies of those books on their website. And this was settled in Madrid Commercial Court, and I tried to find a copy of that court case somewhere, but perhaps on account of the fact that I am not fluent in Spanish, I was not able to do that. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day. The bottom line is that because of the fact that Opus Dei sued Opus Libris for having those books on their website, they essentially were forced to admit that they actually do exist, despite everything that they have ever said to the contrary. And that is really, really significant because a huge portion of this complaint hinges on the fact that those books exist, and they have to exist in order for any of this to have any merit, and we know that they do because Opus Dei showed their hand. So anyway, I think that that's really, really interesting. I think we should keep that in mind, especially as we go forward and we see what ends up coming out of this and all of the various motu proprios that the Holy See has been issuing to try to reorganize and restructure and clean up this mess. So about Escriva and Escriva's rise to power, they say this: from the beginning, he seemed to consider himself a special and extraordinary figure with a transcendental mission. He manifests in his writings that his role is quasi-messianic, frequently above the supreme pontiff and the hierarchy of the church. An institutional problem rooted in Opus Dei since its inception is its idolization. Opus Dei members are usually guided to consider the founder and his successors not with respect and affection, but as depositories of a faith which they call theological. An interpretation of sacred texts by the founder differs from that of other Christians due to the previous idolization. For example, evangelical fraternal correction is interpreted not as an admonition to turn your brother away from sin, but as a means of training that serves both to dominate through denunciation and to standardize human behavior, such as crossing one's legs during a talk. The progressive idolization and sectarian drift were facilitated by the initial presence in Opus Dei of people such as Blessed Alvaro del Portillo, who supported and encouraged the distorted vision of reality promoted by the founder. Over time, a more cohesive and self-referential group was formed that extended the messianic character of the founder to the institution itself, placing its goodness above any other institution of the church and at times above the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Already, in this brief little synapsis, you can already see an indication of how rigid and controlling this organization could be. And as I was reading through all of this, I had the thought that Opus Dei didn't become this highly controlling organization slowly over time. They were that very thing from the beginning. In essence, Escriva and the bite model go hand in hand because he is the well from which all poison flows. It was his ideas and his ideology and his conviction that formed this organization and became the bedrock from which everything else was built upon. And I think that really goes to show that the poison that exists within this organization, it goes back to the very core. It goes back to the very earliest days of the organization. And that is something that's going to end up being relevant to this entire conversation a little bit later on, because I have some thoughts about that. But the authors get into a pretty interesting breakdown of all of the different ways that Opus Dei has displayed this sectarian drift, this tendency towards a highly controlling, non-religious organization. Some examples of this include the group being united by a doctrine that is transmitted in a messianic way and is led by a charismatic figure who considers himself the possessor of the absolute truth. The structure of the group is theocratic, vertical, and totalitarian. Total adherence to the group is required, which implies distancing from social relationships, affective ties, and previous activities. Members live in a closed community or in total psychological dependence on the group. Individual liberties and the privacy of the followers are suppressed. The information that reaches the members of the group is controlled. A set of manipulation and coercive persuasion techniques are used, such as meditation or spiritual rebirth. A more or less strong rejection of the rest of society is encouraged, considering them enemies or at least suspects. The main activities of the group are proselytizing and collecting money. And under duress of psychological pressure, followers are obtained the delivery of their personal assets and considerable sums of money. These characteristics are all applicable to Opus Dei. And if you take a look at the bite model, specifically if you take a look at Stephen Hassan's website and a breakdown that he has comparing Opus Dei to the bite model, there is a lot of really strong correlation, and that becomes more and more influenced the further down we get into this document. Now, all of this comes back to those 46 internal documents pretty quickly, because that is the basis for how the organization is actually run from the inside out. They say that these 46 documents continue to be the true regulations by which Opus Dei is governed outside of the Holy See and against the most elementary procedural norms of the law. They answer to no one but themselves, and they have done everything that they needed to ensure that that is the case. And I think that that was incredibly intentional. I also think that it's really, really interesting going back to that list of various ways that Opus Dei has displayed this sectarian tendency. Numbers 9 and 10 point out that the main activities of the group are proselytizing and collecting money, which is incredibly obvious once you are paying attention and you know what to look for, and that under duress or psychological pressure, followers are obtained the delivery of their personal assets and considerable sums of money. This means that when somebody joins the organization as a numerary or numerary assistant, they are required to give up everything to the organization, every single personal item that is of any type of worth, and any money that they might get down the road from their families. And this actually does also extend to supernumeraries in a pretty significant way, which is something that we'll get into here in a few pages. But the result of this highly controlling, predatory type environment is that people have suffered. They say that the elements are given so that the abuses can be manifested of conscience of power and spiritual power over its members, which in some cases has resulted in the suicide of some members, as witnessed in Opus Libris. Lifelong, irreparable interior damage has occurred, beyond frequent religious traumas, not only in the members who are still part of the institution today, but in those who have left it, with serious damage from which many have not been able to recover even after several decades. This situation poses a serious damage to the members of Opus Dei to the extent that these pseudo-norms have a profound impact on their lives, their will, their moral judgment and personal discernment, their internal jurisdiction, and their personal dignity and freedom, and even the most elementary natural ethics. Because everything about the way that they expect people to live is in complete opposition to just basic human nature. It's a very unnatural environment to live in, and it's no wonder that people end up suffering. They say that within Opus Dei, a single moral norm seems to prevail. The end of Opus Dei justifies the means. Any deviation from the moral order ends up being considered virtuous to the extent that it benefits the institution. Again, this is something that will continue to be emphasized throughout this document, and this is something that I have already firmly believed was a fact, just a simple fact of life when it comes to Opus Dei, that the end always justifies the means as long as it benefits Opus Dei. And unsurprisingly, you can excuse some really horrendous shit if you are operating under that kind of ethos. After consultation with the director of the center, it is taken as a matter of the same, not what our Lord established, but, quote, whatever may go against the spirit of the work, end quote. That is, seeking the strengthening of the institution regardless of Christian morality. Now, then they start getting into some specific examples, and that's all very well and good, but the thing that really stood out to me, the thing that is so weird when talking about these secret books that are kind of shuffled around under cover of darkness, they say that instead of being sent these writings by internal suitcase by other full members, they have been taken by a full member commissioned from the General Council directly to their destination, with obligation to be read aloud and on their knees by all the members of the destination center. So these books are kept in pretty limited supply, and whenever they need to be transferred to somebody so that they can be read, they have to be taken in person. But then it says that that person is expected to read them aloud on their knees to everyone at that next place. What in the world? What kind of bizarre, ceremonial, unnecessary bullshit is that? Why are you having people read these things on their knees? That just really, really made me feel uncomfortable and weird. Another very prominent aspect is the indisputable preference of the good name of the institution over the truth. In October 4th, 2011, as an example, they preferred to lie publicly to thousands of members rather than say that the church had indicated that Opus Dei was going against existing pastoral regulations. But of course, this is nothing but par for course, and nobody should be shocked by it. Because that has been their playbook for a very, very, very long time. And it's quite gratifying to see that represented in this document and to know that, at least if they are doing their job, the Vatican and the Holy See should be reading it. The most painful consequences of the abuse present in Opus Dei is perhaps the suicide and the people who have abandoned the faith after leaving the institution. However, it is important to address the abuses in the field of psychiatric medicine used to break the will of those who dare to express any discrepancy. Now, this is really, really bizarre. But they write that although it could be argued that there have always been people with a certain psychological vulnerability and that this is also manifested in the religious sphere, the high proportion of people under psychopharmacological treatment in Opus Dei is surprising, especially among numeraries compared to other church institutions. Even more worrying is the fact that Opus Dei doctors have left blank, signed prescriptions at the centers, allowing in many cases the directors of the center, without being doctors, to prescribe the psychotropic drugs, thus violating the most basic principles of medical and Christian ethics. That is how you kill someone, or at the very least, so irrevocably fuck up their brain chemistry that they will never ever again be able to live a normal life. It's really, really dangerous to just be handing out pills without really understanding how they work and how they're going to interact with each individual person's brain chemistry. And you know the directors of these centers do not have the education to be able to be making those decisions. I also think the note about people with a certain psychological vulnerability being attracted to religion is really, really interesting. This is something that I have seen in my own life. I have known a number of people that I would consider, I think that most people would consider mentally unwell, who were very, very attracted to religion, Catholicism specifically. A lot of the time it was things like OCD and manic depression and that kind of thing. There definitely seems to be some type of correlation between strict adherence to a religion and mental illness. And I don't really understand what that is. I would like to look into that a little bit more because I think it's really, really interesting. So if you know more about that, sound off in the comments because I am really intrigued by that. I also think that it's worth pointing out that if it is known that people who are mentally unwell tend to be attracted to religions, if it is known that Catholicism attracts people who may not be the most stable, that perhaps there is an onus on the Catholic Church to ensure that the people in leadership positions are properly equipped to handle those individuals, to treat them with care, and to get them the help that they need insofar as much as they are able. I know for a fact that that is not happening. I know that there are very well-educated people involved in the church. Of course, that goes without saying, there are well-educated people everywhere, but it is not a standard that you be educated in any type of counseling or any type of mental health aid in the Catholic Church, at least not as far as I have seen. I'm sure in some cases there are exceptions, but I think there's a responsibility of the Catholic Church here to make an effort to take care of people, especially if they know that their religion attracts people who are not well. That needs to be talked about, and that's kind of a conversation for a separate time, I am sure. If you have thoughts about that specifically, I'd love to hear them, because I would really like to see some type of actionable reform and change made to address and help people like that. Again, a little bit of a sidebar there, but it really stood out to me as interesting. And you have to figure, if I've seen that manifested in just sort of what you would consider mainstream Catholicism, it must be even more concentrated in Opus Dei, and I cannot imagine. These directors, based on the premise that Opus Dei is a family with supernatural ties, exercise the abuse of power, conscience, and spirituality without any restriction mentioned in the previous point. The vocation is almost always presented as a lit lantern, as opposed to the rest of the Christians, who would be the off lantern, which is a doctrine of the founder filmed in front of thousands of people. So first of all, there's nothing familial about Opus Dei's treatment of its people. I always think that that's such a cop-out when it's kind of, honestly, it's kind of a red flag. It's like if you show up for a job and your new employer is like, we treat everyone like family here, you'll be a part of the family. It's like, well, how do you treat your family? Do you treat them well? Or do you treat them poorly? I mean, we know that not all families are the same. There are different dynamics, and unfortunately, there are families that are pretty dysfunctional. So how is that supposed to be interpreted? And should I be running for the hills right now? Opus Dei is not a family with supernatural ties. If they are family at all, they are an extremely sick and dysfunctional one. And I always have to laugh whenever I hear that kind of thing. It is progressively inculcated in the lay organic cooperators that whoever leaves Opus Dei abandons God, betrays him, and becomes creditor of, quote, the pains of hell, with the conscious damage that this has meant and still means in so many people. Opus Dei is a nursery for vulnerable adults. And again, that goes back to the whole mental health thing that I was talking about just a moment ago. I really think that that's something that across Catholicism as a whole should be discussed a whole lot more, and perhaps those conversations are beginning to take place more and more actively in certain circles, and I really hope that it becomes more widespread. They go on to say, and this is interesting to me as well, that it is essential to distinguish the institution from the people, and that it should not be forgotten that sexual abuse always has its origins in a prior abuse of power, conscience, and spirituality, and that in the case of Opus Dei, these abuses are institutionally induced due to relational asymmetry consciously promoted by the institution itself among those who direct and those who are not directors. Only through true humility and a profound search for truth and justice, Opus Dei will be able to find its way to serve the Church fully and authentically, freeing itself from the burdens of the past and focusing on its spiritual vocation. Now, this is kind of interesting to me, and I want to break it down a little bit and then get your thoughts on it, because I don't quite understand some of the ways that some of these things were phrased. For one thing, they say that it is essential to distinguish the institution from the people. And this is something that I have been thinking about for a really, really long time, and as of yet, I have not really found a good, satisfactory answer. I wonder, where does the institution end and the people begin? Because at a certain point, you're being a little bit constipated by insisting that it's an institutional problem when the only reason the institution exists in the first place is because there are people in it. So people are forming this entity that we recognize as Opus Dei. Where do you place the blame amongst all of those people? How do you begin to tackle this thing? Because it's not this pie in the sky amalgamous concept, this thing called Opus Dei that you can take pot shots at and shoot down. It's just a bunch of people. And I don't really understand that logic that an institution is separate from its people. Because at the end of the day, it's people driving the things that that institution is doing. If the evil is institutional, then how do you separate that out? And then they say that only through true humility and a profound search for truth and justice will Opus Dei be able to find its way to serve the Church fully and authentically. I don't want to be insensitive here to anyone who has a lot of love for this organization, although I would argue that your love is unfortunately misplaced. But I really have to ask the question, why do we care if Opus Dei hangs around? What is the big whoop with Opus Dei? I feel like at this point, perhaps, people may have lost sight of the forest for the trees because they are so enamored with this idea of a personal prelature and how unique and special that is, this unicorn that is Opus Dei. But when you step back and look at all of the things that they have been responsible for, especially the human rights violations, why is that worth saving and keeping around? Add on to that the fact that I have never been particularly impressed by Opus Dei's reason for existing in the first place. This whole making saints of everyday people and sanctifying your daily life through prayer and treating it as service to God. That concept I have no problem with. That's a lovely concept. I have a problem with Opus Dei phrasing it like it's this new and original thing that they just thought up. Can you believe it? Escrivá is like such a visionary for coming up with this thing. And I'm just sitting over here thinking, like, has no one ever heard of like Therese of Lisieux and her little way, her practice of doing small kind deeds every single day? I don't feel like this is a new concept. I have never felt like anything that Opus Dei is talking about is a new concept. And if you want to live a lifestyle focused on service to others and service to God, there is a way to do that. It doesn't have to be through Opus Dei. They are not the way, the truth, and the life. And I continuously come up against that every single time someone tries to justify the organization's existence. And especially as we continue to get through this document, again, I keep asking myself, why would anyone want to keep this around? It's a serious question. Answer it if you have an answer. If you can make a good case for why this organization should stick around, because I'd like to hear it. I am of the opinion that it should be dissolved completely and totally. It is perceived that Opus Dei has always used and tries to use the church, using the church as a political entity to achieve its ambitions for power within it. This is, of course, not a surprise to anyone, again, who has been kind of looking into Opus Dei for a while. I did an entire video on Opus Dei's relationship with the Vatican. I think that it is a quid pro quo / tit for tat / you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours type of relationship between Opus Dei and the Vatican, which unfortunately means that I don't necessarily have a ton of high hope for serious reform within the organization. Because the kind of reform that is needed would mean that Opus Dei would no longer be able to function in the way that it is. It would not be able to continue to have its cake and eat it too. And I think that the Vatican knows that, and the Vatican, I believe, in my opinion, benefits from Opus Dei and from them being what they are. And it's no surprise to read something like that referenced here in this document. It's only common sense. They go on to say that Opus Dei has demonstrated a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and self-referentiality in its relationship with the church, which, of course, it's always been about Opus Dei and their own internal goals and whatever is driving them at that particular point in time. It has always been that case, and it always will be. It is imperative that these issues be addressed seriously and responsibly. The Church, together with the competent authorities, must carry out a thorough investigation and take the necessary measures to correct these practices and protect those who have been victims of abuse and manipulation. Hear, hear. So going on to the next part of this, we start to get into the state and civil aspect of Opus Dei, which, again, is just incredibly interesting. Go and read through it all in your own time, but here are some of the things that stood out to me. Opus Dei has used the importance of numbers to gain respectability and credibility. This is, I believe, an example of coordinated manipulation. They are well aware of the fact that the numbers that they profess to carry are not accurate. But it doesn't really matter because nobody can really call them on it, and it makes them look really, really good. There is no consideration of moral obligations when talking about money. The Opus Dei acts in economic matters through opaque commercial companies interposed, secretly controlled by the prelature. Of course, this is not a so secret fact. Again, if you have been kind of paying attention and keeping your ear to the ground of Opus Dei, at some point, you probably have heard of the Woodlawn Foundation and other various foundations and orgs that Opus Dei kind of hides behind. It's very, very annoying, but on top of that, it's also very harmful, and in addition to using it to financially aid their efforts, Opus Dei also uses it to kind of make sure that their hands are kept clean. As an example, in Argentina, Opus Dei has formed 17 interposed companies that own a huge amount of assets. This handling of different associations allows that, in the case of auxiliary numeraries, for example, if there is a labor trial for unpaid wages, most likely the person will have to sue 5 different interposed associations that own the different buildings where they have worked. This makes successful litigation practically impossible if you do not have a law firm capable of following each case. This is, of course, probably referring to the 43 women in Argentina who came forward and said that they had never been paid for all of the years of work that they dedicated to Opus Dei. I really, really hope that their legal team is up for this battle, because it looks like it's going to be a long one. And those women and everyone else who has given so much to this organization and been given nothing in return, they absolutely deserve some type of compensation. And I really, really hope that it happens. Another example is the case of sexual abuse during a camp organized by a men's club, a corporate work of Opus Dei. In response to the complaint, they responded that Opus Dei had nothing to do with it, since the Interposed Society was the organizer of the activities, and that Opus Dei was only in charge of spiritual direction. That is just so slimy and deceitful. I would be shocked if I did not know exactly what I was dealing with. It makes the existence of these different organizations and associations, it makes their existence a lot more sensical to me, and makes sense to me that they exist in the first place, because Opus Dei obviously needs them. The authors go on to talk about this criterion that is experienced as a kind of omerta, and I looked that up, and it's a mafia term that means a code of silence about criminal activity and a refusal to provide evidence to the authorities. They say that, as it is known, the omerta implies a categorical prohibition of cooperating with state authorities or using their services, even when one has been victim of a crime. A person must avoid interfering if they see something that is not correct, and cannot report a crime to the authorities under any circumstances. And because of this, here are some of the things that Opus Dei has covered up. Sexual abuse committed by members of Opus Dei in Chile, Spain, USA, Uruguay, and Argentina. The destination of fugitive members for embezzlement and fraudulent bankruptcies, affecting thousands of victims in Uruguay, Paraguay, Mexico, Spain, and Argentina. Financial crimes and documentary falsification, or avoiding to giving data. Crimes of illegal transfers of people, adults and minors, through cross-border crossings in Paraguay, Bolivia, and Argentina. For those of you listening at home, that's human trafficking. The falsification of documents such as fee receipts and international cooperation fund programs for expenses not authorized by the program. Crimes such as the improper use of stamped and signed medical stubs and receipts used by center directors to prescribe medicines to other members or buy at a discount, falsifying the supposed patient. Conducting black money from the salary of numeraries in the form of donations to interposed companies to achieve tax benefits in the personal income tax return. And they say that recently a priest from the Priestly Society of the Holy Cross, in reference to this immoral aspect of Opus Dei, and in clear self-criticism, told us in confidence that the permanent cancers of the church have always been power, money, and hypocrisy. When does this thing metastasize past the point that it's able to be controlled? Especially in the case of Opus Dei. And are we at that point yet? You know, it's kind of like that country song, you gotta know when to hold 'em, you gotta know when to fold 'em, you know, I gotta know when to walk away, you gotta know when to run. I think we're well into running territory, personally. About the numerary auxiliaries, they say this, that they are treated as victims of authentic slavery and human trafficking. Although currently, due to various judicial sentences against Opus Dei, the auxiliary numeraries have access to Social Security, the institution continues to violate and distort the truth in relation to the contributions of these women, who never charged for their work actually carried out in the institution. Even to date, a tenured member, a judge in Argentina, has told a journalist that Opus Dei does not pay them, nor would they pay their sisters. So basically, the only time that Opus Dei ever does anything correct is if they are forced to by a more powerful legal authority. Otherwise, it's within their best interest to continue to skirt the law. It's within their best interest to recruit from insanely young pools of people who do not have a fully formed brain yet, do not have a fully formed personality or perspective of the world. It's within their best interest to recruit these people insanely young. It's within their best interest to recruit from communities of people who are perhaps not very economically well off, who are desperate for opportunity and will take a chance on something like this and send one of their young daughters off to live in one of these centers to work, ostensibly under the concept of learning to earn a living wage. But we know that that's not what happens. And then within this document, we have testimonies of sexual assaults and suicides and human trafficking and all kinds of fraud. I mean, how you come back from this, I do not know. So at the end of all of this, this is what the authors request. And this is pretty interesting. They say that first, they request an intervention of the Holy See so as to protect Catholics who have been members, are members, and could be in the future with the suppression of Opus Dei the way it is currently developed. Second, we request, alternatively, in parallel or after this measure, the refounding of the institution by the church hierarchy with new rules and new rulers who act with the feeling of the church. Third, we request provision so that in economic matters derived from the above, the rights of people are respected and acted with justice. Fourth, we request canonical penalties for those mainly responsible for the illicit actions included in this complaint. So again, this comes back to the authors behaving as if they do not expect that or believe that Opus Dei should go away entirely. And I understand they probably had to be very careful about how they worded this. This is a very political situation, regardless of whether or not it should be. It just simply is. And in order for this to have the best chance of garnering the reaction and the results that they are hoping for, I am sure they have to be very calculated in the things that they say and how they say it. But as a third party outside of all of this peering in, I am not bound by those constraints, and so I can speak a little bit more freely. And again, I do not understand why nobody is willing to just say this organization needs to go away. I mean, let it be said, let it be heard. In my opinion, Opus Dei needs to go away. It should be dissolved completely. You can build up something new in its place if you really like the idea of this personal prelature and this organization of lay people, but the way that it is being done in Opus Dei today is not sustainable, it's not good, it's not legal, it's insanely problematic. And I really would love to just hear somebody say that, and I don't understand why nobody will. If you have thoughts on that, let me know. If you have, just thoughts generally, let me know, because this is so fascinating to me. And then their last and fourth request, a canonical penalty for those mainly responsible for the illicit actions included in this complaint. What would that look like? As far as I know, the Vatican does not have the power to send people to prison or to issue fines. At most, they can turn evidence of actual crimes over to the correct authorities, and then what? Excommunicate you? If that is the greatest threat that someone would be under for not behaving, is just simply excommunication. If the crimes are already this severe, do you really think that an excommunication is going to make them suddenly quake in their boots? The threat of that possibility is all of a sudden going to make them snap to and get their act together? I don't think so. And then lastly, before we move on the final page, they say something that, honestly, when I read it, it sent chills down my spine, and I think this is the perfect thing to close this complaint off with. I think that this is the cherry on top of this whole thing. They say that any legal solution that is given to them from leadership of Opus Dei will be taken as something to cede without conceding with the intention of recovering. They will wait, they openly say so, for this pope or the next ones to pass in order to recover what Jose Maria wrote in 1974. They think that about 70 years is the time they will have to wait to achieve their purpose, in view of the environment that is breathed today in the Church. If the ultimate purpose of Opus Dei is not known from the authority of the Church, It will never be possible to adequately address the institutional problem. They will always deceive the Holy See. Opus Dei has the long game, and they always have. They are in it for the long haul. They are hunkered down. They are ready to do what they have to do to get to where they are going. And I have some real thoughts and theories on where exactly that destination is, and we can certainly speculate about that. But the fact that they so publicly, at least within the organization, talk about waiting it out, waiting until conditions are more favorable to act, that again indicates to me that they know exactly what they are doing. None of this is accidental. They are calculated, they are cool, and they have the money to do whatever they want to do. And the Vatican knows that. We'll see what happens. We will see what happens. Something else that they talked about in here that I didn't stress as much was they mentioned that there had been situations where, in an effort to maintain control over the members in Opus Dei, priests had even been caught violating the confessional seal. Now, if you're not Catholic, never been Catholic, don't know anything about Catholicism, then you probably don't realize how big of a deal this is. The Sacrament of Reconciliation, going to confession, is basically where you go and the priest acts in persona Christi, or in the person of Christ, basically as a sit-in for Jesus Christ, so that you can tell them the sins that you committed and ask for forgiveness. And anything that is said during confession between a party and a priest is between the two of them. It is not something that can be subpoenaed. If a person went and confessed to a priest that they had committed a heinous crime, the priest would not ever be able to be called to a witness stand to testify that this person had admitted to this crime to them. It's really, really, really significant. And the fact that Opus Dei priests, some, are violating this is a huge deal. So I wanted to know what people had to say about that. I wanted to know if there were any stories, and I wanted to hear it as near from the horse's mouth as I could. So I went digging on Opus Libris, and I found a couple of examples, and we're going to go over those now. Again, I will leave these linked down in the description below. The Opus Libris site is obviously all in Spanish. If you access it via Google, you can use Google Translate, but Google Translate, she's doing her best, but sometimes she can be a little bit dicey, and the translation is not the greatest. So if you'd be more comfortable reading something like this in Spanish, you can go and access that down below. But I'll go over and give you the meat and potatoes of it. So the first letter on Opus Libris is from someone saying that they found a story on Opus Libris that made their blood boil. He said, when this person narrated the way in which tenured priests skipped the sacramental seal by forcing the penitent to talk to them before entering confession, my blood boiled. Of the 11 years that I spent as a numerary in different cities and centers, several priests acted like this with me. Several priests in different centers and cities acted like this with this individual. When I would go to confession, they told me to wait for them. Sit down, let's talk first, they ordered, and for a while I told them the miseries for which I wanted to ask God for forgiveness. When finished, they told me, now, on your knees, and the confession itself began, but with a particularity I did not have to repeat what I had already said before. Okay, then you confess to what you have told me about something else. These people acted like this so that I could tell my miseries to the directors without violating the sacramental seal. This practice is not only an abuse of conscience, but is also prohibited by the Church. Moreover, for some canonical crimes, sexual abuse among others, if these took place as a result of the knowledge that the priest had through a confession, we are before the so-called delicta graviora, for which the most serious penalties are reserved. You are not above the rules of the Church. You cannot do whatever you want. So the individual that he was referencing posted their own account of a similar situation. They said, on the subject of the sacramental seal and the work, I would like to ask those who understand the most about something that happened to me on December 26th, 1981, the first day of a retreat course I was attending. Around 10 p.m. that day, shortly before going to sleep, I requested a confession with, redacted, a tenured priest who attended the retreat course in a small town in the province of Valencia, Spain. The priest was surprised to see me request a confession, asked me before starting the sacrament, quote, "Is it masturbation?" I forcefully replied that I wanted to confess without comment before the sacrament. And he said verbatim, even more energetically, "Let's cut this nonsense," so that I would tell him about the sin before beginning the confession. In short, he forced me to tell him what I was later going to confess to him. Technically, it cannot be said that this priest violated the sacramental seal, but it is no less true that they made me, coerced me, and forced me to manifest something that I wanted to be reserved for the sacrament of penance. I consider that as an aggravation of the fact it appears I was beginning a 5-day retreat course and I was not going to have a material possibility of confessing to another priest other than that one. So these are just 2 stories, only 2 examples, but I mean, if it's mentioned in this document and there is at least some corroborating evidence to support it on Opus Libris, then I have no reason to believe that it is not very, very, very common, and that breaks my heart. Opus Dei, in my opinion, one of their worst traits is the way that they treat people. Their complete disregard for people's autonomy and freedom and personhood. It is very, very clear that they do not care for those traits at all, and it is within their best interests and the goals that they are attempting to carry out to quash that as much as they possibly can. And everything that they do to members within these highly controlling environments is carried out to that end, including potentially, allegedly, violating the sacramental seal, which is a really big fucking deal. Pretty heavy stuff, pretty wild. Before I get into, I want to talk about what it looks like when maybe somebody tries to bring Opus Dei to heel a little bit. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the experience of supernumeraries. I feel like supernumeraries often get overlooked a little bit because they don't live in the centers. They're allowed to get married and have families and have jobs and, for all intents and purposes, live a relatively normal life, as far as we know. But I think that their experiences are probably just as traumatizing and dehumanizing as what some people experience as numeraries, not as assistant numeraries, obviously, because I think that's a whole separate ball of wax in this entire thing, the human trafficking and everything like that. I mean, that takes this all to just a whole different level. But I think supernumeraries have gotten overlooked a little bit because it seems like they're doing fine. Like, they're allowed to have a life, they're allowed to leave, they're allowed to live outside. How much control can Opus Dei really be exerting over them? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. I went online and started looking around and asking some questions, and I went looking through the subreddit r/Opus Dei Exposed, which is a wonderful resource if you are someone who has left the work and is looking for a community and a support system, if you are someone who has a family member who is stuck in the organization, or if you're someone who's just looking for more information. r/Opus Dei Exposed is a great place to start, and there are some really wonderfully brilliant people in that community. And some of them had this to say about supernumeraries, and it's pretty interesting. This person said that my mother was a supernumerary, and the influence of the directresses affected our lives in a concrete way. I remember one day when I was in high school, my mom suddenly declared that TV was prohibited from Mondays to Fridays, which confused me because I was an honor student. When I asked her why, she said because her directress said so. I should have seen that as a red flag, but then I felt in my desire to please my mom, I whistled as a numerary. Their influence in day-to-day lives of not just the couples, but also their children is so palpable. Last story. When my mom passed away, we wanted to cremate her because it was less expensive than having a full burial, especially after my family's finances were drained fighting her cancer. While I was preparing the funeral arrangements, her directress called me and said we should bury her. I explained to her that my family already decided to cremate her unless they're willing to pay the cost of an expensive burial. I was amazed that even this very intimate event, they still tried to impose their will. This person said, my suspicion, based on the general behavior of supernumeraries I know, is that at a minimum, Opus Dei probably pushes married supernumeraries to have children in ways that go beyond general encouragement. For example, pushing couples to try to have children again very soon after a miscarriage or the birth of a disabled child, or pushing younger families to set aside natural family planning and just have children, and claiming some sort of religious sanction for their advice. This doesn't have to do with the couple's bedroom, but I do know that supernumerary couples do have to clear major household purchases with their spiritual directors. When I was helping take care of my ailing grandparents in the 2000s, lots of seemingly routine stuff, a new computer, a dishwasher, had to be run past their spiritual directors. It didn't seem that onerous, though I remember I was told to choose a lower speed processor for a computer I was helping them buy so that the price would be lower, and the reason was because their spiritual director told them to do it that way. This person says that one thing I've learned on this forum is how applications of Opus Dei rules can vary at the local level or between numeraries and supernumeraries. My grandparents joined a long time ago, the 1960s, well before I was born, so they may well have been carrying on with a more rigorous practice of the rules or working under guidance from especially rigorous spiritual directors, even after the regs have been loosened for younger members. One more example of Opus Dei's involvement in the financial affairs of supernumeraries is that supernumeraries are told to make wills treating Opus Dei as another child. So instead of dividing an inheritance 3 ways among one's children, supernumeraries would divide their inheritance 4 ways, with a share for each child and 1 share for Opus Dei. In addition, female supernumeraries are told to leave the diamonds and their wedding rings to Opus Dei because Opus Dei traditionally lines the tabernacles in its centers with those diamonds, which is really kind of wild and trippy to think about. And then last but not least, a friend of mine, not of the work, but had a grandfather who was a supernumerary. When he passed away, the numeraries came to the house and totally took over the funeral and preparation of the body. Her grandmother was not allowed any say in what happened because it had been written. The family were told that her grandfather had willed everything to Opus Dei and had informed them in advance of his wishes. The grandmother, who was not Opus Dei, later found out that there was no money for her as it had already been given to Opus Dei before he even died. They were left struggling. Opus Dei did nothing to help them. This happened in a country in South America. So those are just a few examples, but I think that they point to a much more concentrated degree of oversight and control in supernumeraries' lives than would perhaps be immediately evident from the outside looking in. Now, I'm not saying that they are exposed to the same types of treatments as numeraries or, of course, assistant numeraries, but the fact remains that they are no less impacted, and oftentimes it would seem negatively so, by their close proximity and participation in this organization. It seems at the very least what most often happens is that these supernumerary families are encouraged to give way more money than they probably should to Opus Dei, which puts them at a severe disadvantage because they are simultaneously encouraged to have way more children than perhaps would be financially prudent. Children are not cheap. It's really, really expensive to raise a family, and Opus Dei likes really big Catholic families, but they also like the money that those families donate. So who's left in the lurch? The supernumeraries. Last but not least, before we close this out, I wanted to show you something that I found. I think that this is a really good example of what it might look like if someone actually tried to rein Opus Dei in, how that would kind of manifest, and I really like the way that this was done. So back some 18 years ago now, Friday, January 21st, 2005, where were you when? The Guardian published an article called "Is Opus Dei at Work in Blair's Government?" And this is referring to the UK. In this article, they say that in 1981, Cardinal Hume laid down some very strict guidelines for Opus Dei to observe if it wanted to continue operating in Westminster. He had accepted complaints that it was secretive and subjected young people to excessive recruitment practices. So I went and I found the guidelines that he created and issued, and I'm going to read through them with you now. It's quite short, and I'll also leave it linked down below, and then I'm going to talk about it because I think it's pretty interesting. So this was December 2nd, 1981 that he issued this. He says that for a considerable time I have studied carefully certain public criticisms made about the activities of Opus Dei in Britain, and I have also examined the correspondence addressed to me on the same subject. Some of these letters have been critical, some have expressed sincere admiration for the personal qualities of members of Opus Dei and appreciation of their influence. I've also had meetings with those responsible for Opus Dei in this country. Opus Dei is a movement of priests and lay people within the Church which has the official approval of the Holy See. However, insofar as it is established within the Diocese of Westminster, I have a responsibility as a bishop to ensure the welfare of the whole local church as well as the best interest of Opus Dei itself. As a result of this study, I have made known to those responsible for Opus Dei in this country what I consider to be the right recommendations for the future activity of its members within the Diocese of Westminster. I now wish to make public these 4 recommendations. Each of them arises from one fundamental principle, that the procedures and activities of an international movement present in a particular diocese may well have to be modified prudently in light of the cultural differences and legitimate local customs and standards of the society within that international body seeks to work. Now, pause right there. I really, really like the way that he wrote that. I really, really like the way that he presented the information, because it strikes me as a very calculated political thing. Once again, he is expressing a desire to kind of bring Opus Dei to heel a little bit. I mean, he doesn't say that, but let's call a spade a spade. That's exactly what it is. Yet, even so, he makes very sure not to other Opus Dei or alienate them in any way. He is being conscious of the fact that they are an organization founded in Spain, and he's using that to be like, hey, I get it. You have different standards in your country, like different norms. Certain things are acceptable there, but like, you're in the UK now, mate. Like, you have to keep that in mind. But he did it in such a way that I think it would have been not as easy for Opus Dei to get their hackles up. I'm sure they still did. Anyway, goes on. These recommendations must not be seen as a criticism of the integrity of the members of Opus Dei or of their zeal in promoting their apostolate. I am making them public in order to meet understandable anxieties and to encourage sound practice within the diocese. Again, so well said. So well said. The 4 recommendations are as follows. 1. No person under 18 years of age should be allowed to take any vow or long-term commitment in association with Opus Dei. 2. It is essential that young people who wish to join Opus Dei should first discuss the matter with their parents or legal guardians. If there are, by exception, good reasons for not approaching their families, these reasons should, in every case, be discussed with a local bishop or his delegate. 3. While it is accepted that those who join Opus Dei take on the proper duties and responsibilities of membership, care must be taken to respect the freedom of the individual first, the freedom of the individual to join or leave the organization without undue pressure being exerted, secondly, the freedom of the individual at any stage to choose his or her own spiritual director, whether or not the director is a member of Opus Dei. And then lastly, 4th, the initiative and activities of Opus Dei within the Diocese of Westminster should carry a clear indication of their sponsorship and management. He closes, I am confident that these 4 guidelines will in no way hinder Opus Dei and the apostolic work to which it has committed itself, but will help it to adapt to the traditional spirituality and instincts of our people. I will naturally remain in close touch with priests and members of Opus Dei within the Diocese of Westminster. He was making a very good effort, and I'm not aware of Westminster and the situation over there. I have no way of knowing in 1981 and the following years how effective this was, but as just a blueprint, a template of what potential reform could look like if the church hierarchy started taking a more active role, I thought that it was excellent. Going back to this article from The Guardian, it's unfortunate to note that Cardinal Hume ended up passing away not too long after this, and his replacement, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, chose to welcome the organization in and give them a parish in Swiss Cottage. Now, maybe that would have happened eventually anyway. Maybe it was just a matter of time until Opus Dei gained a greater foothold within Westminster, regardless of whether or not they were, being sneaky or anything like that. Maybe that's just something that would have happened and it was just a matter of time until they got a church. But the way that it reads here in this article is that Cardinal Hume attempted to do a good thing, passed away, and then his replacement basically undid everything that he had done. And I know just from my own research and the things that I have seen, that Opus Dei is very much alive and well, particularly in the independent school system in the UK. It's not so very different from what we saw in the Four Corners documentary about the two Parad schools in New South Wales, Australia, which I did a whole video about just last time, so go and watch that if you haven't already, because that video is a perfect encapsulation of how and the ways in which Opus Dei is going after young people for recruitment into the organization. Even though they're not supposed to be, and even though they say that they're not doing it, they very, very clearly are. And that goes for this entire document as a whole. I mean, this entire thing that we read is just full of examples and cases in which Opus Dei is doing things that they would never admit to doing, is doing things that they have denied doing, and is spreading information that they have attempted to deny the existence of, but which we know now irrefutably truly does exist. So I thought that it was really important that we go over this and spend some time talking about it. I thought that it was really important for all of you to be made aware of it if you weren't already, and to get this out into the mainstream conversation just a little bit more, because while on the face of it, all of these motu proprios that the Pope has been issuing and all of this Vatican canonical stuff is very dry and kind of boring, it's really, really important. And when you read this document, it's not hard to understand why. All of that canon law stuff is very, very dry. But it kind of represents our only real hope for any type of Vatican-enforced reform for Opus Dei. This is the information. These are the facts as they are laid out in this document. Go, please, and read it for yourself. If you enjoyed this breakdown and this discussion, give this video a thumbs up. I have it on good authority that there is more to come. So stay tuned, because whenever that happens, we'll be talking about it then as well. All of my socials are linked down in the description below. You can follow me, you can connect with me, and you can email me if you need to. Go and check out r/Opus Dei Exposed if you are looking for some real-time one-on-one community type stuff. I know that a lot of people are feeling like they've been deprived of that, particularly in this space. And, you know, Reddit is not all bad. Sometimes it can be a pretty useful tool, and that's what they're trying to do over there. So go and check that out if you're at all interested. Thank you for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. I will have a new video for you very soon.